Oh, here's a good question, or an interesting question. I know Dara is opinionated on. Jody G, full stop, says, Sup lads, do you guys ever do speed bench with your athletes? And would you recommend speed bench for combat athletes? And if so, at what percentages of 1RM? Also, would you use chains or bands in that situation? So we never do speed bench. So the use of high velocity training in purely powerlifting sports doesn't make any sense, because when you place the powerlifting movements on the force velocity curve, at the we're at the very top there, squat, bench and deadlift are high force movements with low velocity. So when you put them up there, they are not really required to use a lot of velocity. They're not heavily reliant on velocity. Now there's obviously some speed, you can't move them as slow as possible, but using speed isn't really an important factor. Expression of force and expressing as much force as possible, and if you do go too fast, essentially you won't be able to express as much force as possible, which sounds kind of like it doesn't make sense in some regards. So the heavier weights, the speed or velocity aspect doesn't seem to make a huge amount of difference. So training velocity at lighter weights just doesn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah, people get it really mixed up between like power training and velocity or speed benching, you know, because what you'll often find is they'll do like speed benching for 5 reps and they'll do it at some really light weight and they're just looking at how fast the bar moves. Like, there's two factors matter in power training, and that's the weight that's being moved, so that's the amount of work done, and then how fast that work is being done. So power, the rate at which work is done, if you're doing very little work, so if you're moving 20 kilos but you're moving it at 5 meters per second, that's much less effective than moving 50 kilos at 4 meters per second. So it's a really simple equation. Where people tend to get mixed up is they tend to think that in my sport I move my arms very quickly, so if I'm a combat athlete and I punch forward really quickly, that my training should then be punching forward really quickly like this. Now, you have to do a strength phase and then some sort of transition phase and a power phase after it, right? What people really focus on, they'll buy like a velocity meter for their barbell and they'll say, okay, I'm going to keep it at 2 meters per second and I'm going to progress weight from week to week at 2 meters per second. So if Gerf can move 40 kilos this week at 2 meters per second on a bench press, then he'll go to 42 kilos next week, 45 kilos next week, 45 kilos the week after. And then you'll kind of gradually get this accumulation of volume or accumulation of weight moving that bar at a certain pace. What you need to instead think about is the main limiting factor for power and the main limiting factor for speed is 1 rep max strength. So at anything around 50% of 1 rep max and above, the only thing that matters for speed and power development is 1 rep max strength. So if I have a bench press of 100 kilos, the real thing you're looking at is getting that 1 rep max number up higher. So you're looking at combat athletes in this case, what you would typically do is spend a lot of your time. In our case, we recommend spending 60% of your time in that actual strength development phase, so proper strength programming. You're not looking at throwing a barbell around the place. It's accumulation of volume at relative or at intelligent kind of relative 1RM weights. And then after that, 60% of your time, you go into a power realization phase where you take that newly built strength, that newly built motor pattern, that increase in proprioceptive awareness, and you start to move a barbell faster then. So it's not, people think they want to be moving a barbell faster all the time. You need to build actual strength because that's the main rate limiting factor. And then you need to realize how to use that strength in a quicker or higher velocity or higher output setting. In the case where people want to use chains and bands, to be honest, I've never once seen it. So this is facilitative loading or whatever you want to call it, where as you stand up higher into the squat, it gets more attention. So there's more chain off the ground, so you have more weight. Or obviously as you stretch a band more, there's more tension in the band. I have never seen a good case for an athlete using chains or bands or any of this kind of variation for the sake of variation stuff. To be honest, the only reason people would ever really use that is if people are struggling to concentrate and they really need to get someone to focus on something. There's very, very niche areas of injury rehab So if you're restricted in a certain range of motion where you might want to take some of the loading off someone, take for example in the bottom of someone's squat, if they have a mechanical issue in say an ankle or a knee, and everything below parallel is very, very difficult for them, but they still have a real need to train above parallel, you could do some facilitative stuff where the weight is taken off by some bands as you sit down into the very bottom, and then as you stand back up again, it will get heavier. But to be honest, it's almost useless in every case, bar those very, very small niche applications. Just training with a barbell and plates and sensible progressions and sensible periodization will make you far stronger, far faster, far more powerful and resilient to injury than any amount of bands, chains or shite like that.
I could see how chains might be novel in a hypertrophy context. So if you were doing flat bench or something and you were just added chains just for a reduction in loading so you don't have to put as much pressure. If you're quite advanced and you're quite strong, I could see how the use of chains would be something novel, not something necessary, but something just kind of unique to add a extra level of difficulty, I suppose, to the top of reps without increasing hugely the amount of weight at the top. But other than that,